After Boris Kagarlitsky's keynote, Professor Barry Gills from the University of Helsinki will give his commenting remarks, and then we have still, hopefully, time for audience questions. Professor Kagarlitsky, добро пожаловать.
Спасибо. Thank you, Mina. And first of all, of course, I have to thank the Development Studies Society and Alexander Institute who made this trip possible and made this speech possible. And of course, I'm always very happy to come to Helsinki, although I haven't been to this place for a number of years for many reasons, mainly because of the work I had to do at home. And I'm especially happy to kind of return back to Helsinki and to be able to speak here. Well, actually, yesterday morning, preparing for this keynote speech, I started looking through my notes, and I reread the summary which I sent as my keynote presentation to the organizers of the conference, and the problem is that I didn't like it. Actually, I was very embarrassed and frustrated. So what I did, I decided to change the presentation completely. This is partly a kind of bad news for Barry Gills, who's going to comment on the paper which he didn't read. Though yesterday night we had a short chat with Barry, so I gave her some idea what I'm going to talk about. So hopefully it's not going to end up in a disaster. But still, I think that it's not only that I didn't like what I have written, but also, you see, since I have written the original summary, there was so much happening around the world that it also made me think about certain issues which I consider now to be most important to be discussed exactly in this particular audience and this particular conference. So I'm going to speak about the future combination of development and democracy and whether they are compatible. Because if we are looking at the papers, at the research and the ideologies which were developed in the 1950s and throughout most of the 20th century, of course mostly within the progressive liberal paradigm, but partly also among the left, at least within Western paradigm. Two key words were present, development and democracy. So these were two big words in economic and political science. And of course, there was a bit of a contradiction here, because though everybody was praising democracy, at the same time most states which were practicing development were not democratic. On the contrary, they were quite authoritarian. And most of the success stories which were presented as success stories and which really had much to present were connected to the development strategies which were designed and practiced in countries which were quite far away from any kind of democracy. So at that time, the whole notion of development dictatorship emerged. And it was quite trendy, and at the same time, though it seemed to be a contradiction, it was not such a contradiction within the framework of this approach, because the way to kind of reconcile democracy, development, and dictatorship within this discourse was to say that democracy needed preconditions. And these preconditions were created through development. Well, that's quite natural. Yes, you need educated people, you need a certain level of urbanization, you need certain institutions, and so on and so on. And these institutions are created through development process. Well, okay, these institutions are created by an authoritarian state, but thus you can end up saying that through these development strategies, an authoritarian state actually contributes to the creation of preconditions for a future democracy. So in that sense, it was not such a contradiction between democracy and dictatorship, as long as development was seen as the way towards democracy. And by the way, if you are looking at the experience of the so-called communist countries, looking at the experience of the Soviet Union and its republics, again, yes, it seemed that the theory looked in many ways correct, because the Soviet Union was a developmental state and was a kind of quintessential developmental dictatorship. And at the same time, Soviet Union, through its development, did create a tremendous demand for democratization, which ended up in the process of perestroika, and finally, in one way or another, institutions of formal democracy were introduced in quite a few countries of the former Soviet Union and the former communist states, though in many countries that they did not survive. As we know, if we are looking at Central Asia, it does look very, very promising. But however, well, yes, if we are looking at this concept from some sort of empirical point of view, we could say that by the mid-1990s, this theory of development creating preconditions for democracy did work. Because most countries, or at least many countries, which used to have developmental dictatorships, ended up in establishing some sort of liberal democratic institutions, at least formal ones. Whether it was South Korea or republics of the former Soviet Union or Latin American states or even some African states. So in that sense we could say, well, yes, the theory worked, the concept worked. But if we are looking at the events of the following decade, quite a few questions emerge. Because one problem which I can see very much from my post-Soviet and Russian experience, but I think it can be also seen from the experience of people in many African or Latin American or to some extent even Asian countries, to a lesser extent Asian countries, I guess, is that once we acquired something which at least looked like a democracy, development stopped. To make things worse, quite a lot of achievements of development were reversed or became threatened, jeopardized. So does it mean that dictatorship is better for development than democracy? That's not what I'm going to say. I'm just going to say that we have to reconsider the very notions of democracy and dictatorship and see this very process in a very different light. So, first of all, what made developmental dictatorship developmental? What's the difference between just a dictatorship and a developmental dictatorship? This is a very serious question. And of course, you are looking at policies, but it's not just about policies. Let's look at that from the social perspective. And then there is one very important difference. The characteristic aspect of dictatorships which did practice real development, which did realize progress along the lines of development, that characteristic specificity was that they were repressive, but they were not only repressive against the people, but they were also repressive against certain sections of the elite. This is a very big difference, which is absolutely essential for the argument I'm going to develop. Well, whether we are looking at Stalinism, which was extremely repressive in many, in every respect, but I stress it was also more repressive against the elite than against the bulk of the population, even though, of course, it was quite hard for everyone. Or whether we are looking at South Korea under military dictatorship, or in that sense, even if we are looking at Iran, whether under the Shah regime, which failed, or under the Ayatollah regime, which actually worked. In every single case, we end up discovering that there was quite a lot of repression against the elite to discipline it and to make it work for development. And that was exactly one reason for the successful states to enjoy at least some level of popular support. By the way, here we end up with a very interesting contradiction, that on the one hand, there was popular support for the policies and for the state. On the other hand, there was resistance. And again, I think people very often see that mechanistically. They're saying that the population either resisted the state or supported it. But it's not true. This is how things are seen by the ideologists or even by political scientists. But in reality, very often the same people supported particular policies of the state and resisted other policies of the state. And the same state very often promoted policies which benefited the people, and at the same time they repressed these very same people. So it's a much more contradictory picture if you are looking at it not simplistically but in detail. So it's a kind of dialectic of development and repression which we are facing here. So in that sense, the big question emerges: what's the social nature of this developmental state? Because you see, this kind of state, if it is capable of repressing or disciplining the ruling class, means that it is this state is more or less autonomous vis-à-vis the ruling class and the ruling elite itself. So in that sense, it is not exactly a class state. So in that sense, again, we're coming back to the big debates in Marxism, because Marxism, classical Marxism, is expected to interpret every state as a class state, as the instrument of a particular class. But actually, if we are reading Marx in more detail, with more attention, we discover that's not the idea of Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx, when he was writing about the absolutist states of Western Europe in the 16th and 17th century, what he wrote was that the state managed to acquire specific position of autonomy vis-à-vis all classes of society, and that was exactly why these absolutist states worked. That's why they actually provided real progress. So they were not directly implementing the policies of a particular class. So of course, they were not independent of class contradictions. They were representing these class contradictions, but it doesn't mean that they were really implementing a policy of one particular class, disregarding others. And, well, look, enlightened absolutism of the 18th century, what was it? Historically, I think it was exactly the predecessor of what later became, in the non-Western world, what we now see, or we call, developmental dictatorship. These were the first developmental dictatorships. And in that sense, we can develop on that hypothesis, on this idea of Marx discussing these societies and states which emerged during the 20th century on the periphery of the Western world, whether it was the former Soviet Union or some African post-colonial countries and elsewhere. And we definitely see that these states were more or less autonomous of major classes of the society. But still, even if the state is autonomous, it doesn't mean it lacks social meaning and social core. So the point is that in this particular case, the basis of the state is not a class, but rather an agency or an agent. So a social and political group which is much narrower than a class. And this is exactly what allows this group to play this autonomous role vis-à-vis major classes. So what are these groups? They were different in different cases. These were military in some cases. These were specific bureaucracies in some cases. These were parties in the case of communist regimes. And in smaller countries, they were even functioning as extended families. So in every case, you have a narrow group which acquires, because of some specific reasons, whether because of a revolution or because of some other factors, acquires this capacity to act as an autonomous agent vis-à-vis major classes of society, reshaping and transforming these classes. But here we are also getting into a big problem, because this group is not reproducing itself without changes. It keeps changing itself while changing the society, changing the state, changing policies, changing conditions of development and promoting development. It is also changing itself, and it changes. On one hand, what's the first change which usually follows at some stage is that this group which is good news, of course, it is becoming less repressive, especially towards itself and towards the dominant classes of society. That's quite natural. The more prosperity, the more success you acquire, the more reason there is to become more humane and less repressive and to operate through nicer kind of methods. But then what happens is that, of course, this group acquires more and more privilege. And either it merges with the broader dominant class, with the broader elite, or it becomes, or extends itself, develops itself into a new elite. So it acquires the characteristics of a class which exactly makes it less and less capable of operating as an autonomous development agency. So in that sense, it's a kind of dialectic that the very success of these developmental efforts very often undermine the very agency which promote these efforts. And of course, again, if you are looking at specific cases, there are plenty with the military all of a sudden becoming entrepreneurs in quite a few southern countries, or bureaucrats becoming capitalists, and so on and so on. So we have plenty of stories, and just I have no time to go into detail, but every researcher working on every specific case can bring about quite a few stories. But here we are coming to the next stage, which is very important for the understanding of the collapse of the so-called communist regimes, which is that this very situation of growing privilege of the elite is creating two types of discontent, two types of reasons for discontent within the society. Because on the one hand, you see the people who are becoming increasingly critical about the elite becoming more and more privileged. And by the way, the very fact that the elite is becoming more humane and less repressive also makes this criticism much more vocal. There's a big irony that in a certain sense the situation gets worse. Sorry, in a certain sense the situation gets better, but in terms of public opinion, the opinion of the people about their state, the situation gets worse. So this is another paradox. However, the very same elite is also getting increasingly unhappy. It is unhappy with its own privilege. Why? Because it is not enough. Because for them, this privilege is a kind of half privilege. You don't get hereditary status. You don't have enough property. You don't have enough freedom to operate with the property which you control, and so on and so on. You want to become real bourgeoisie, real capitalists, real oligarchy, to acquire all the necessary conditions to use your property and to use the resources you're in control. And So these two types of discontent, ironically, within the society, they mix and they merge into one discourse, which is the discourse of democracy. Because everybody thinks that democracy is a miracle, that once you acquire some kind of democratic institutions, everybody is going to get what he or she wants. Well, people will get justice, and unjust people will get more injustice to please themselves. Everybody is going to be happy. The ones who are unhappy with privilege will get the freedom to protest against privilege, and the ones who don't have privilege will have the freedom to protest against the privilege of the others, and the ones who already have the privilege will have the freedom to increase their privilege. So freedom is something everybody wants, and that's exactly what everybody gets. You're not going to get development, you're not going to get happiness, you're not going to have what you really think about in terms of material wealth, you're going to get freedom. That's exactly what you're going to get. You want it, you get it. It's like asking the genie. The genie gets you exactly what you asked for. What you get is freedom, period. Nothing more. And of course, different social groups use this freedom for different purposes. But in one sense, everybody gets another specific consequence of this freedom. And the consequence is that everybody is getting less and less responsible. Because one of the freedoms we acquired in the former Soviet Union, and I think not only in the former Soviet Union, but also elsewhere in the former developmental dictatorships, is freedom from responsibility. And it's not only about the elites, it's also about the masses. Because, you know, if you speak now to people in Russia, and in Ukraine, and in quite a few former Soviet countries, they will say, we were cheated. We were promised something and we got something else. That's a very common discourse. You speak to everybody, everybody will say, we were cheated. Actually, I disagree. We were not cheated, we cheated ourselves. That's a different story. But in a certain sense, everybody got exactly what was promised or what was demanded. And even if you are looking at privatization, okay, somebody got, oil wells, companies, buildings. Okay, but individual people, they also got flats privatized or some other minor things. So just at some point, people saw that there was a tremendous difference. There was a tremendous disparity. Somebody got something very small and somebody got something very big. But everybody got something. But the important thing which everybody got was freedom from the obligations and from the responsibilities which existed within the developmental state. Because the very essence of developmental state was about discipline. Freedom of discipline is what everybody got. Whether it's the elite or whether it's the people. So that was a kind of tremendous liberation. But it ended up in a tremendous decline which undermined not only specific structures of development, but it undermined specific behavior patterns which are essential for the development and which I think in the long run are essential for the survival of society. So in that sense, we are getting into a serious trap, because the more indisciplined and disorganized and individualized society are getting, especially given the new liberal economic conditions which were imposed everywhere on the post-developmental societies, the more you need to rediscipline the society. So does it mean that we have to go back to dictatorship? So this is exactly the big question and the big trouble. And well, I think the answer may be a little bit more optimistic for one reason. I don't think, even if somebody wants to impose a proper classical type of dictatorship now, it's not going to work. Whether it's good news or bad news is a different story. But I don't think the conditions for classical type of dictatorships exist now in most countries, which doesn't mean that there are conditions for democracy either. So in that sense, we are just in this new situation when everything has to be reinvented. And another interesting phenomena is that, as we were speaking about the agency which existed in the early developmental projects, this agency doesn't exist now anywhere, or at least we don't see it now. So we could see, like in the early 20th century, that was this, for example, the military were, in most countries, they were potential agents of development. They had the discipline, they had the idea of technology, they had the idea of organization, modernity, and so on and so on. Not anymore. Bureaucracy, well, it's a big question whether bureaucracy can play the role of a development agent, and so on and so on. However, what can work potentially, at least it has to be considered very seriously, is a broad social coalition of forces which can be interested in development, or which can be interested in social justice, or can be interested in democracy. And these forces can form particular political and social movements capable of transforming societies. But here again, we are facing a big problem, because again, it's very easy to say that, it's not so easy to make it. A slogan looks really nice, but what about politics? And another big point here is that usually when you have an interclass movement which is bringing together different social forces, these movements usually function as populist movements. What is populism in social terms? Because of course you say, well, populist leaders are leaders who are good speakers, there are crowds coming to listen to them, and they can promise everything to everybody, and so on and so on. No, populism is not about that. There are plenty of good speakers who are not populists. And there are plenty of populists who are very bad speakers, actually, by the way. My personal experience with Hugo Chavez was that I was so impressed that he was so bad as a speaker. I listened to him quite a few times, and I thought, well, he's not like Fidel Castro. He was a bad speaker, actually. The strong side of Hugo Chavez was something else. It was not about how he spoke. It was how he behaved politically. It's a totally different thing. And in that sense, the big question about populism is that populism is a movement which is bringing together different social forces and contradictory interests, which for a while can operate as one project, very often around one leader, and that's exactly why this leader is essential. Because this leader symbolizes the unity between different contradictory forces. When you have a movement which is much more homogeneous, you don't need the figure of a charismatic leader so badly, because you exactly needed it to bring together these forces which otherwise could fall apart. But then you need a specific kind of leader who is also capable of keeping all these forces and tendencies together. And very often they fail, the movement disintegrates, and the project collapses. And then all of a sudden people who seem to be very popular become incredibly unpopular. And very often they perish. But the big question again is whether what we need is yet another populist movement or a coalition, or what we need is what Antonio Gramsci used to call a historic bloc, which is not an unconscious combination formed by a leader or a group of people, but a conscious combination of organized social forces which come together, but not just to back one leader who is capable of bringing them together and keeping them together, but a conscious policy of self-made compromise, when social agents and social forces are organizing themselves, compromising and developing a project. Again, whether it's possible or not, this is the question of politics. But then we're facing yet another very serious problem here, because there are societies which experienced developmental dictatorship. They also developed a certain phenomena which Anna Ochkina, a colleague of mine, called passive democracy. People are used to certain practices, and people are used to having certain rights. They see these rights as really organic, and they see these rights as absolutely necessary. So in that sense, it's a democratic political mentality which involves the idea of rights and even some basic ideas of citizenship. However, why she called it passive democracy? Because it's not about acquiring these rights. It's not even about protecting, defending these rights. It's about people expecting these rights to be respected by the others, by the state, by the elites, and so on. So, in that sense, it's a democracy of expectations, not a democracy of action. So the question is whether people who are formed in this tradition of passive democracy can become political and social agents of change to form what would be an active democracy. And again, the question is not so easy to answer theoretically, because it's a practical question. But I think once we come to to speak about politics, the big problem is that within that kind of approach, certain elements of authoritarian political culture are becoming inevitable. So what we end up with is a strange combination of democratic and authoritarian political culture which emerges out of this situation. And by the way, speaking about discipline, I can remember, I come back to remembering a very important, a very interesting thesis by George Lukács, this Hungarian Marxist of the early 20th century, when he discussed the dictatorship of the proletariat and said dictatorship of the proletariat is often seen as a dictatorship of the proletariat against its enemies. But it's only part of the story. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the dictatorship of the proletariat against itself. Workers have to discipline themselves as workers. Individual workers are disciplined by collectives. Collectives are disciplined by the class. And for that purpose, you need certain element, a certain aspect of coercion and authoritarian organization. But this is also a very dangerous aspect of social change. Because on the one hand, without these elements of discipline and coercion and even dictatorship, it's not going to work. On the other hand, we know that all these authoritarian elements tend to consolidate into specific practices and institutions which later block all the democratic potential of social change. So how can we get out of this contradiction? I think only through historic experience. So you have to push towards some social change, and very often you're pushed back, and then you have to push again. So it's not something which happens once and forever. There is no decision, there is no one answer that you can just have this one answer forever and repeat it and just be sure you have the right answer and you know the answer. No, on the contrary, you have to pose questions time and again, answer these questions, theoretically and practically. And you should know that within a few years, your answers will not be relevant anymore. And even when you are successful, the tendency is that people often think we were successful, so we have to repeat the approach which made us successful. But very often it's exactly the other way around, because when something worked, it changed the situation, it changed the conditions, it changed the society, and the new conditions prevent these particular methods and these particular approaches from working successfully again. So the very fact that you were successful before often means that you're not going to be successful repeating the same thing again. So that also means that we have to face this dialectic of authoritarian democratic measures and approaches and practices. And this is exactly the tragedy of decision-making, the tragedy of action. Because it would be so easy and so nice to say, well, we can be always so democratic, we can always operate according to the democratic methods and so on and so on. The only problem is it's not going to work this way, unfortunately, in the real world. And then again, we're coming to yet another question, is whether certain democratic institutions and practices can be launched in a top-down way, as again I quote Anna Ochkina, manually. That's exactly the big question of so-called enlightened absolutism, or enlightened dictatorship. Dictators who were trying to impose democratic practices on society. Whether it can work or not, again, a big question, but whether there can be some well-meaning authoritarian governments trying to democratize themselves. Theoretically, yes, but again, it's a practical question. So, of course, the general rule may be very simple. So you have to be authoritarian when it is inevitable and democratic whenever it is possible. But yet here I'm coming to the final concluding remarks, which are the most problematic, because what we were talking about, it was always about so-called developmental states, about southern states, about Eastern European states, about whatever, third world states, second world societies, and so on. No, it's not only about it. It is also about Western Europe, and it's also about so-called advanced democracies, which are also beginning to face quite a few problems, which are increasingly similar to those of the East and those of the South. And with the deindustrialization, which is taking place in Western Europe and in North America, also we are facing quite a few problems which are similar to those of the countries which used to be underdeveloped, or used to be called underdeveloped. So in that sense, you can see that definitely the South is getting more developed, at least in technical terms, not necessarily in social and cultural terms, but in technical terms, definitely there are more industries. If development was about industrialism, as people used to think in the 20th century, then you see that the South is more developed now than ever before, but the North is getting less developed. And of course, then you can come to all this post-industrial discourse saying, wait a minute, it's all services, it's all post-industrial technologies, information science, and so on. No, it is not true. Don't let yourself being cheated. Quite a few services which are coming to replace industries in Western Europe are not post-industrial, they are pre-industrial. Quite a lot of social and economic and even technical decay is taking place together with neoliberal reforms. People are brought back into pre-industrial jobs rather than promoted into post-industrial jobs. And at the same time, what we are facing is a tremendous crisis produced by migration waves from the south. And what causes the crisis? Because we also have all these debates about migration. Well, of course, on the one hand you have the racist argument, on the other hand you have the humanist argument, and so on and so on. But there are two big problems to be faced. One problem is, why do people come? They're not only coming because of wars. Well, you know all this story with Syrian refugees. Most of Syrian refugees now have been to Syria. Most of them don't even speak Arabic. They're not escaping from war. They're escaping from de-development of their own societies. That's what makes them rush to Europe. They're rushing to Europe expecting that these societies are developing, or they're providing them with the fruits of already achieved development. In reality, what they face are societies which are deindustrialized and de-developing themselves because of the neoliberal policies. So in that sense, people are escaping from the societies which are not providing good industrial jobs and industrial culture and proper social conditions, to the societies which are actually dismantling their welfare states and their industries. And that makes the situation worse in both cases, because countries of the South are losing quite a few active people who can be important for their development in the future, and people and countries of the North are getting people whom they cannot accommodate. But they cannot accommodate these people not because they're Muslims and not because they're Southerners, but because these societies in the West themselves are not producing good jobs, they're not producing industry, they're not producing development, they're not producing welfare conditions for everyone, and not producing new incentives for people. So in that sense, this kind of global village is coming to the global city without acquiring the possibility of getting integrated into this urban way of life, because the jobs are not there, the conditions are not there, infrastructures are not there, educational capacities are not there, and so on and so on. So that means that some kind of reindustrialization of the West is necessary, and that also means that reindustrialization and development is not just a strategy of societies which are going to get back to some kind of welfare state, but it's also a strategy which can provide us with a new capacity of integrating the world, because we have to accept the fact that it's not only a global world, but it's also a world which is disorganized and has to be reorganized. And in that sense, reindustrialization is one of the major strategies which can enable this new development. But again, what kind of industrialization, what kind of industries, what kind of industrial strategies? All these questions are opened. And what kind of state to become the actor and the agency here? So I leave most of these questions open. If you expect me to give you answers to all these questions, you're facing the wrong person. However, I'm not giving you these answers not because I think these questions cannot be answered. I'm just thinking that these questions cannot be answered on a pure theoretical basis. They cannot be answered without practice. So the big problem with all of us academics and intellectuals is that we spend so much time in doing research and so little time changing the world practically. And probably it's about time to go back to work. Well, we have to overcome neoliberalism. We have to overcome the kind of political and social impasse into which we've got during the last 25 years. And everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people now know that the system is in crisis. But, well, somebody has to do something about it. And the very fact that we recognize the crisis doesn't mean much. And unless we do practical political and social work on the ground, with the people, among the people, facing all these problems, exposing us to all these problems, I think there's going to be very little progress. So, well, at some point, I think we still have to be optimistic. And I mentioned the term passive democracy. So the big question is whether we can move from the society of passive democracy to a real society of active democracy. In that sense, democracy is not something achieved in the West. Democracy is something to be achieved globally. Thank you.
Well, I think you can see that he has someone very capable of addressing the Q&A. And we all give him another round. a good thing you decided to rewrite the whole thing. This is very difficult. It's difficult for me to know where to intervene. I make some observations that might, in some ways, complement or provoke certain things that Boris was trying to analyze for us. So bear with me. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is probably to ask what kind of development do we want? Terrain of struggle, always to be appropriated, redefined, contested, yes, right? And there are many now who find that within the paradigm of development as industrialization and as economic growth, as ever-expanding capital accumulation and resource extractivism, that this is now bust. This is a fundamental problem, right? Not to repeat that as development, but to reinvent development for the future, and that is the struggle, right? But a kind of materiality that has been extensively globalized. Okay, so that the international division of labor is now so extended and deepened and complex, and everyone on the planet is enmeshed in it and dependent on it. This is a kind of precondition, right? Because it's a different phase in global history than the past. Right? So now, there's another sort of standing admonition. This whole immensely problematic relationship between development and democracy. You ask who is in power. If you're looking at the relationship between the state and development, you ask, as you did in part of the analysis, who is in power exactly is always asked for every state. What interest do they represent? What group are they? How have they formed this group? Why do they want state power? To what ends will they put state power? What are they trying to achieve in general and for their own interests? What norms and so on will they reproduce? All of these things are always asked in every specific instance, right? And they all vary. This is always varying. No? So then, I think that we are all aware, and recent data has shown us about the underlying processes in the way globalized capitalism has evolved. Under neoliberal economic globalization pattern in the last few decades, we have an immense oligarchization. We have oligarchization within many societies, and we have it globally. The concentration of wealth, the concentration of control over capital. Capital is self-expanding, and the more capital, which Piketty has shown, the more capital you command, the more capital you create and command. And capital is not just a social relation, it's also a very central form of social power. So this problem of oligarchization is one which can also be studied historically. So, for example, I once, a very long time ago, yes, in the early 90s, looked at it historically and read people like Rostovtsev, you may have read, economic historian of the ancient world, and where he talked about capitalism, democracy, absolutism under the Hellenistic age, and the death of democracy. The denouement. Yeah? And what his basic observations were that this was an era, we're talking so the 3rd century BCE to about 3 century period in the Mediterranean world. That this was a time when oligarchization became extreme, and with it, slavery proliferated as never before in the society. Huge concentrations of wealth, but also with absolutist monarchic states who were allied to the oligarchies to wield power against all the rest in society, to exploit them. Right? But at the same time, the democratic constitutions of so many polities across the Hellenistic world, their form was kept. The formality of democratic constitution was retained, while in reality, all the vehicles of power, beginning with the magistracies, the judiciary, and then on, all of the real levers of power within the whole state apparatus were seized by the oligarchy. And that led to the Roman Imperium and the total death of any democratic element in the constitutions anywhere in the Mediterranean. It was the end. You see? So there are some lessons of history. We can even go back to the ancient world to see where the road of hyper-capitalistic practices, extending and deepening, super-exploitation of labor and natural resources, oligarchization and absolutist states, and then you get the death of democracy. It's not the triumph of democracy through free market equals democracy, and the more you free the market by that ideological paradigm, the more you will achieve democratization. That has been challenged for over 20 years as being fatally flawed, and in fact, the reality might be the opposite. That it destabilizes substantive democracy while retaining the form's formal democracy. So you have the illusion of democracy without the reality, because real democracy, substantive democracy, does mean that contending social forces, ideologies, and their political mobilizations actually are able to take power in succession, one to the other. And when they do, there are radical transformations in the state policy and in society and so on. It has huge, real consequences, this changing of power. But if you have a low-intensity democracy, which was put in place in the 1990s, with neoliberalization, you say, well, we're against authoritarian regimes. The hegemonic power holders in the world decide ideologically in a campaign, we will now no longer formally support authoritarian regimes in the name of stability and the defense of freedom in the West, because now they're a liability. And perhaps they don't serve the interest of neoliberal economic globalization policy, which we see as being in our interest of our transnational corporations and our globalized financial houses. So we shall dismantle and help to aid and abet dismantling these authoritarian regimes and replace them with low-intensity democracies. Those democracies have a conservative hegemony as its historic bloc which rules the state, not the formal dictatorships of the past, but a democratic regime, but the democratic regime which constructs power so that radical change and transformation and challenge to those policies cannot be successful. So you have kind of a permanent embedding of conservative hegemony, socially speaking, right? Okay, so there's a slippery slope, which some people I won't name, but in the long debates over the developmental state in East Asia, in which I played a small part because I studied South Korea for a very long time and did fieldwork there with labor in the state and globalization. That there's a slippery slope of apologetics that some people fall into, because you'll be familiar with this, saying that, as you said, if industrialization and economic growth in the conventional pattern is development, and is the answer to poverty, is the way out of underdevelopment, it's the one path, right? Then you want to discipline capital, absolutely essential. You discipline finance, you discipline capital, you have economic planning in a capitalist state, and capitalism is very compatible with dictatorships and non-democratic regimes. We know this. Much example of this, right? And the most successful of the developmentalist industrialization pattern, which rationalizes and sequentializes the industrialization strategy, does all sorts of things that are not in the liberal paradigm, but it achieves rapid industrialization. Yes, but they are dictatorships, and they are extraordinarily repressive towards the whole society, including capital. There are severe penalties for capital to disobey the discipline of the 5-year plans, and if they don't support the state elite who are in power. And labor is disciplined, society is disciplined, students are disciplined, everyone is disciplined, right? And the human rights abuses are systematic, and it's a police state surveillance. This is all known. But then the apologetics comes in to say, but that is justified because in the end they had a democracy. But then what happened in that democracy? You can see the turmoils in many of these democracies. And so that is the kind of thing you were saying at the end, which I thought your conclusions were very appropriate indeed. You know, it's like that these are the sorts of things that there may be a malaise of democracy rather than a triumph. And this is now deeply embedded for decades. And maybe we're now at this sort of acute conjunction phase in this, for many reasons that you were talking about. And no apparent solutions outside of very hard struggle. Right? The absolute necessity for praxis. And maybe capitalism has been moving in its globalized form retrogressively, not progressively, when it comes to democracy. So the specter haunting the globalized capitalism is re-authoritarianization. The populism we see around the world right now is part of that. So you have this reversals and reversals and reversals, not only of development itself, but of the actual substantive freedom. Right? But it's not all's not lost. It's back to Gramsci. I take the approach, pessimism of the intellect, Optimism of the will.
Thank you, Barry, for very interesting observations and comments.